Hey everybody! Excuse my pale skin and naked face, but it's usually naked anyways, so whatever. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about borderline a little bit in a more scientific way, I assume, in terms of like cognition, which is like your particular way of thinking or, you know, and how borderline is affected in cognition by childhood trauma. Because for the most part, borderline comes from childhood trauma and partially some genetics, but there's not much research on that. So I can't be 100% positive in that, but it's mainly affected by childhood trauma. Okay, so let's start with childhood. I have a thing in notes right here, so if I keep looking down, I apologize. So during childhood, these are really important years. These are developmental years. If you take a developmental psych course or something like that, you can learn about the stages of development from childhood up, and you'll notice that 4 to 6 is really like prime time for development and kind of shaping a personality. And that's usually the role of the parents to influence the child and how they make decisions. So 87% of subjects with borderline personality disorder had histories of severe childhood abuse and or neglect prior to age 7. The mean age or average age was 5 years old that they experienced sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, or neglect, or some type of traumatic event during that time that later on developed borderline personality disorder. Other personality disorders had no significant relations with those abuses, but borderline had 87% developed borderline. Neglect had long-term deficits. Good lord. Had long-term deficits. God, I can't talk. Had long-term deficits compared to other forms of trauma. So I noticed that sexual abuse went down over time. So I'm assuming treatment or something like that influenced the up and down. But neglect had more long-term because it's about attachment and security. So if you were a child and you didn't feel close to your parents or you had attachment issues and it wasn't like a secure place to be, it wasn't your safe place, then that is kind of considered trauma. Trauma is what the person perceives. It's not really defined by something, but if it's something bad to someone or traumatic to someone, then it's traumatic. This one blew my mind. 30 times more childhood trauma compared to soldiers. What? We think of PTSD as only applying to soldiers, but in reality it applies to a lot of people, especially if you have personality disorder, PTSD alone from whatever traumatic event you experienced. That was a really crazy statistic to me. It's all about living in an environment where it's dangerous for the child. So that kind of leads to trauma for the kid. Okay, so that was my little spiel on childhood. Now the deficits that come from the trauma in childhood. Poor focus, concentration, memory problems or distortions. Distortions are kind of like a blip in the memory. There's something about it that's kind of distorted. Impulsive behavior such as impulsive sex or unsafe sex rather. Fast driving, drinking a lot, just things like that. Shopping, that can definitely be one. And then difficulties with logical reasoning. So, I remember begging my doctor, like, I'm struggling with my concentration, my memory, my everything like that. And nobody believed me until I finally went to my physician and had to make the argument that borderline has significant deficits in cognition, memory. The The greatest deficits were with visual memory and planning, which is weird because I obsess over planning and I love making planners and stuff, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm that great at following through, I guess. But with the memory problems or concentration issues, ADHD and borderline personality disorder share symptoms including impulsiveness, emotional instability, and difficulty controlling anger. Children with ADHD were 5 times more likely to develop borderline personality disorder. And the brain systems involved in regulating emotions, which were often associated with borderline personality disorder, also were similar to the ones affected by ADHD. So they're not necessarily comorbid or diagnosed together or, or have that kind of correlation, I guess. But they were affected in the same areas. But just because someone has ADHD doesn't necessarily mean they have borderline personality disorder. I think we know that, though. There's less activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is involved in problem solving. So that might explain why someone doesn't know how to respond to a certain event, I guess, is a way of putting it. I know that I have difficulties problem solving. I have to analyze all of it before I make a decision or respond. But I do have my moments where I do just lash out, and that's part of my emotional regulation thing. It was cool to know that people with borderline personality disorder tended to have higher IQs than healthy individuals that participated in the study that I was researching. I feel like people with disorders tend to have higher IQs and also tend to be more creative, is what I have heard. But the thing with memory is we can get the information and remember it. It's just the hard part is recalling the information or retrieving the information and applying it. 25 to 30% of people in this study did not show significant deficits, which is normal, but that's something to remember is not everybody with borderline personality disorder is going to have a significant deficit or deficits. The most frequently affected domains are memory response inhibition, planning, and planning, and that's all affected from the frontal region of the brain, which is associated in emotion regulation. Also, I have on this other piece of paper. So, part of borderline personality disorder, you can dissociate, which is that out-of-body experience some people do have, which is it's a normal response to some things, but some people have overactive brain regions. And depersonalization is where you really don't know who you are, kind of thing. So the areas affected by this are the parietal cortex, which help you feel sensation, the insula, which is kind of the state of your body, like how it's doing, the posterior cingulate, which is where the body is. It kind of tells you, where's my body? It's here. And in dissociation, you can see why that would be affected due to the whole out-of-body experience. Pretty much all parts of the brain that are related to self are kind of just thrown away. In dissociation, the body doesn't really experience itself, kind of given in the whole out-of-body experience. I have more info. Also, with childhood, 53,000 people were studied, and 1 out of 10 were emotionally abused, 1 out of 4 were beaten by 1 or more parents, 1 out of 5 were sexually abused, 1 out of 4 substance abuse or alcohol was involved, 1 out of 4 were exposed to mental illness, and 1 out of 8 were exposed to family violence. So the most frequent exposure was in childhood emotional abuse, followed by loss of a primary caregiver, impaired caregiver, domestic violence, childhood sexual abuse and neglect, and then childhood physical abuse. I think that may be it. Yeah, that's it. But I just thought I'd give you some stats on borderline personality disorder and what was affected and kind of how it was and how it all ties together. I know that I have problems with my memory. I've been forgetting everything for like a good while now, and it's kind of scary. It's like, I don't know if there's something else going on or what, but they have technology that can kind of like detect your brain waves and do stuff like that, but I don't have the money to go do that or research trial to go to, because borderline's way under researched, and that's partially why I made this YouTube channel, is to kind of raise awareness for it. I wish that I could participate in a trial. That would be fantastic, but I can't find anything close by here to participate in, which upsetting, but whatever. And I also found that it was really interesting with the whole planning thing, because I try really hard to plan. Doesn't mean I'm good at it, but I try really hard. But I can see I experienced childhood abuse, and it was mainly neglect, so I'm looking at long term here, folks. But other than that, that's all I've got today. I'm going to do a video about medications that are good with borderline personality disorder after this, I think. It takes me a second to make these videos because I have to do the research. But other than that, that's all. Hope you all have a good day, and you're beautiful and lovely. Oh my god. Okay. Bye.